Empty Cloud Monastery, as you all know, we're quite big fans of the suttas. And usually when we read many of the suttas, first time I read the suttas actually, I was always very blown away by what the Buddha calls the Asuttavasutta, the uninstructed worldling. And then usually, as soon as the Buddha describes the uninstructed worldling, then he gives the example of the conduct of the noble disciple right after. And what was really amusing to me at the very beginning, amusing and actually depressing at the same time, was that as I was encountering first the description, the wording, the uninstructed worldling, I was, not identifying with this world, the uninstructed worldling. I kind of like more the noble disciple. But then when there was this description of the actions of the uninstructed worldling, out of my surprise and depression, I was always fitting the description of the actions of the uninstructed worldling rather than the noble disciple. And, usually when we're reading other material in the world, whether it's literature, whether it's perhaps a newspaper, whatever it is. I mean, if we're kind of averagely okay in the world, if we're not completely immoral, completely kind of, off sort of not with the best of conduct, we usually kind of don't really associate with the description of, the kind of like bad person that is being spoken with in the news, right? We're kind of like, oh yeah, there's a different behavior, and yeah, I fit with the other behavior. Yeah, that's very good, right? So we can come with that. At least I remember having a bit of that conceit, right? I was like, oh, of course I'm not the uninstructed worldling. Wait, I'm the uninstructed worldling. How is that possible? How very, very interesting. And actually, this is one of the most beautiful things about the Dhamma, about the teachings of the Buddha, that actually it explains to many of us, most of us, actually the majority of us sentient beings, how we're all uninstructed worldlings until we actually find the teachings. And then we become, well, still instructed, but still worldlings. But at least we have, a little bit of information, of a kind of map, of a bit of a more understanding of what's going on. And then we have a good example, the noble disciple, who is essentially navigating the world just as we are, but has already done what needs to be done, has already gone to a place of cessation of suffering. And the canon is full of examples of how essentially we start by a suttava patujinas, and then we become a little bit suttava. And there's actually some beautiful suttas also that, one of my favorites is the Asuttavasutta. That is precisely that, the sutta of the uninstructed, which is a very interesting sutta. If I remember correctly, it's in the Nidana Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha talks about the uninstructed worldling relating essentially to the body. And we have actually in Buddhist environments, we talk a lot about the body. There's lots of meditations on the body. There's lots of practices that encourage the analysis of the body. There's a whole, in the Satipatthana Sutta, the longest sort of chapter, is all about contemplations of the body, to fully understand the body, right? It's nuts and bolts, so to speak, and also in understanding how we relate to the body. The 4 elements meditation is one of my favorite practices, where it kind of really gives us an insight in the sort of materiality of the body, and in how actually we're experiencing constantly the body. But in that sutta, in the Asuttavasutta, it's very interesting because the Buddha presents us, he tells us, actually the uninstructed worldling can actually come to a realization of the body as not being, who they really are, as not being their atta, as not being something that belongs to them. This body with its four elements, right? Because also this body, we can see this body is kind of, especially the more we age, we're kind of getting a sense of how it's a little bit unreliable and, starts aching a little bit more, and we get a little bit more sick than usual. And then we're like, oh, those things, that I had read about, what's it called? The bones. And I remember my parents, used to start lamenting when I was a little child, but now I am not the parent, but the age of my parents, right? And going like, oh, this is what they were talking about. Oh, how very interesting, right? So we start getting a sense of the unreliability of this chunk that we carry around. We're also like, it starts wrinkling and getting all, less than appealing. The teeth perhaps get a little, just less reliable than they were. Right? So it's like this, kind of crappy thing, right? So we start having a little bit more dispassion, or perhaps if we're, in our youth still, and so we're still intoxicated with our body. But if we actually start observing the body of our relatives or our loved ones, we can start seeing this process of decrepitude happening, perhaps not immediately, obviously, in ours, but definitely around us. So we can actually have a sense. We can have a sense of the actual nature of this sack of meat. We can actually kind of go like, it's really not that, not that attractive. There's also a theory in the Therigatha, Subhajiva of Mango Grove, that actually when she's in the forest and she's stalked by a stranger that essentially wanted to convince her to disrobe and kind of run away with him, and starts complimenting her and harassing her, a bit of catcalling here and there. And apparently Subha was really beautiful bhikkhuni. And so the rogue, in the forest, keeps telling her about all of these like beautiful characteristics of her body, beautiful features, and especially he gets really obsessed with her eyes. And so she's like, all right, you really like these eyes? How about here you are? And literally takes the eye. That's it. Do you like it now? And in that moment, the rogue had a sense, right? Of, actually, this piece of earth element is not as attractive as it used to be. I'm sorry, noble lady. I'm out of here. I feel like, in the Asuttavasutta, that's essentially what the Buddha is talking about, even though it's not that the rogue, for example, in this story, in this encounter with Subha, it's not that he became awakened. It's not that he had any type of profound realization of Dhamma, but rather just with the experience of the body, was able to get a kind of like a little bit of a better understanding of this matter. So the Buddha is like, actually, it's possible that an uninstructed worldling can do that. And I remember when I first read that part of the sutta was like, wait, then what's the point of this practice? Like, I thought, actually not even quite there yet, and I didn't need Buddhism to do this. And it's quite interesting how the Buddha is like, you don't really need, the teachings of the Buddha to actually come to this realization. The Buddha says then afterwards, but the uninstructed worldling, he can realize this, but, we can actually see this body, standing, these four elements with these four great elements for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, 100 years, right? It's like, actually, it would be better if the uninstructed worldling identified, would make more sense if the uninstructed worldling identified with this body rather than with consciousness, with namarupa, with all the sort of, sorry, not the rupa, the nama, mentality, all the kind of like realm of ideas that we have, the consciousness, the kind of non-material experience with what we call chitta, what we call also the mind, right? Because actually the mind, what we call the mind, what we call consciousness, what we call all these, non-physical things are actually changing every instant of a second. Like in every moment, there is so much shift. And actually here it's in the suttas where the Buddha presents the simile of the monkey. He says, actually, even though this physicality, we actually, since for the past, couple hours that we've seen each other, we kind of all seem pretty consistently like, this body seems quite consistent, right? But how many conversations have we had? How many thoughts have we had throughout these hours? How many things have we perceived? Impressions that we've had, ideas that we've had, right? How many? So the Buddha says actually it's, no different than a monkey going from branch to branch, from branch to branch. Yet, that's truly what we really identify with, right? If we do those incredible practices of really looking at what we identify with, right? We start with the body. So we're like, oh, okay, I look at, my fingernails and like, oh, is this who I am? Looks like me. Then cut my fingernails. Oh, it's not me anymore. Then the hair, like, oh, hair. Well, I have a bit of a difficulty doing that practice. Right? Yeah, we go to the hairdresser, we cut the hair. First it's me, then it's not me. It's not too shocking, right? So if we start chopping up, perhaps intellectually our body and start labeling each part of the body, we really are not too attached to any part of it, right? We're like, okay, it's kind of like nice to have this arm, but also if I didn't have this arm, I would still be me, still like Ayya Soma. And even if I didn't have these legs, well, quite inconvenient, but still, yeah, my sense of self is still there, like even decapitated, like it's okay. I don't really need to have this like face, not particularly attached to it, right? So we can chop it all up, and like we really don't have that much of a strong attachment to this chunk of meat. Like there's a little bit, yeah. It's useful, and perhaps there are certain parts of ourselves we like. Maybe we're really, vain. We really like ourselves, and we're like, oh yeah, you're very beautiful. But we're still like, okay, if this didn't exist, I would still exist. So who is this I? What is that sense of identification, right? And when we think about it, it's all actually not a chunk. It's not something that we can hold on to it. When we think, okay, what is it that we think we're afraid of death, both of ourselves and others? What is it really? Right? It's that cessation of that experience, of that consciousness of having an experience. So thoughts are our sense of self that comes into all our million different identities. I'm a creative person. I am a non-creative person. I am a scientist. I am a monk. I am whatever it is, right? I am American. I'm Italian. I'm blah, blah. I'm a woman. I'm a man. I'm transgender. Whatever it is, like all of these different things, those are really, what the kind of immateriality. And I'm not talking about the physicality of it, how it manifests. Oh, the Italians usually have sort of darker hair or whatever. But all of the literature, all the stuff that comes with that, all of the immateriality of it all of the descriptions that we think are there. And then we can also rename them, right? Can be shifting, etc. But it's very difficult, right? Very difficult to actually really understand how is it possible that that is not who I am? How is it possible that that is not? How is it possible that is the one that is changing constantly all the time, but it's yet not that apparent? How is it possible that we identify less with something that is so much more reliable, so much more with a sense of continuity, as the Buddha invites us to see, than the things that are not actually that reliable, not that permanent. Everything is impermanent, but there are certain things that are more impermanent than others. So it's very interesting how, the Buddha gives us this invitation to really reflect on what is it that we really are holding on to. And then he gives us instead the approach. He offers the approach. What is it instead? How does the noble disciple relate to all of this? All of this, which is not essentially identifying, obviously, with this immateriality or with this materiality, but rather understanding that both this materiality and this immateriality is dependently arisen. So with this arising of this arises. When this exists, this comes to be. When this doesn't exist, this does not come to be. When this ceases, this ceases. And so the teachings of the Buddha also, when he invites us to see non-self, he's not saying anatta. He's not saying that the self does not exist. He's not saying that the self exists either. He's not saying that all of these things are solid, nor is he saying that there's a complete, they don't exist at all. But rather, that in each moment, there are causes and conditions that create a result. And when all those conditions change, well, actually even one condition changes, then we have a different result. And that's why there is not anything that really we can hold on to, both with our rupa, and that we know for sure Western science actually is very thorough. Or just, I would say, world science. Now, it's not even Western science, but we're in the West, so let's talk about Western science. Right? It's like it's telling us that in every moment, there's cells that comes into being and cells that cease to exist. So if we start labeling each one of them, going soma, 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 poof, soma disappears. And so we constantly have appeared and disappeared, actually multiple times throughout this existence that we call as such. Yet, the mind, what we call, once again, the mind, what we call is not material. Apparently it disappears even more so, even faster, has disappeared already as we've been talking so far, right? Is that like crazy? So there's always this question, like one of the frequently asked questions is that if there is no self, then what gets reborn? Right? So what is it that gets reborn? What is it that gets reborn right here, right now? What is it that we're doing? So very interesting. I was spent quite a bit of time with my parents who are in Italy, who are pretty atheists. And they are in their 80s. So death is something quite real, you know, like in the sense that it's creeping in, and almost every day there is news about one of their friends or acquaintances that is dying. And, you know, there's the news of death constantly surrounding them. And there's also the sort of, decrepitude and the death of body parts, part of their experience. And they're actually constantly complaining, by the way, about about how terrible, you know, the process of aging is, right? And when I was back with them last time, I was with some Buddhist friends. At a certain point, they asked me some questions about, you know, like my weird beliefs as a Buddhist. And they're like, oh, so what is it that you believe that happens after birth, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, yeah, so in Buddhism, I mean, we also have paradise, hell, and somewhat kind of like purgatory too. There's like Catholicism, there's a bit of overlapping. We don't call it exactly like that, but there's like stages of in between. And then I told them, but you know, there's also, we can come back as humans and as animals. There's lots of different states of existence, and they're all impermanent. And my parents had a very unusual reaction to all of this, which was, oh, that's quite interesting. Give me more. Tell me more. So how does this process come into being? So could I be reborn in Thailand? My mom really likes Thailand after she's been here. She quite likes it. She's like, oh, I could be reborn in Thailand. Oh, as a human. Oh, that's quite nice. And my dad, oh, yeah, I could be, you know, reborn, I don't know, in France. He likes cheese. So it's like, quite like that idea of rebirth. And I was like, hey, Mom, Dad, you know that like wherever you're born, whether it's Thailand or France, you're still going to age and then die. So the process that you're experiencing right now, it's bound to be repeated. And it was so interesting to, even though that is like a present current experience of my parents, they were like, you know, but it will be different. And then still, you know, like it's not that you're born already with old age. There's a lot of time to enjoy before getting to that stage. And it was such an interesting teaching of Bhavatanha, essentially the craving for existence that the Buddha tells us. That's basically what keeps us in this predicament constantly, but not only, you know, in the moment of death and birth as we normally talk about it, but in every moment, this is essentially what keeps us. It's the fuel. It's how we recharge. It's the gas that we put in our sort of experience. So that constant craving of, deliciousness. What kind of rebirth is next? This one was kind of mediocre. All right, a little bit of dukkha. Sure, the next one will be great. How don't we have that, right? Like we go to a restaurant, it's like, food is all right. Sure, that one is going to be better, right? Or if we weren't born here, for example, I'm pretty sure, that we all were like, definitely would. That's what brought me to the United States. I was like, Italy really sucks. There must be something better. And I go to the UK. UK also sucked. So I was like, there must be something better. And then I would go to New York City. I'm like, New York City also sucks. There must be something better. And we can do that with everything. Like jobs. This job sucks. I'm pretty sure this other one's going to be better. Relationships. Yeah. So where is that momentum, that wanting, that fuel that we put in? And so all of this is very interesting. It's not for me to give you an answer, but rather it's really an interesting way of starting to explore our experience, to start looking at how we form our attas and how we find our attas delicious, our senses of self. That are not connected to to this lump of body, not connected to any particular physicality, but the atta in the sense of what it represents to us, that deliciousness and that wanting to experience also different attas, want to create different identities and different realities. And seeing, investigating that through the lenses of the Dhamma, through the lenses of the teachings. So, yeah, this is what comes to mind this afternoon.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
All right, and at this point, if there are any questions or comments, we can discuss a little bit. Otherwise, we can continue with some more meditation. Andy.
Thank you so much for that talk. I've been wondering about a word for a while, and I think it's started. Can you talk about the source? So, like, what is the source?
The source.
Yeah.
As in the English word the source, or the source in relation to?
The Buddhist source. Like, I have a Dharma name, and it's like of the source. And I don't know what the source is, but people are always like, I'll see you at the source.
You should ask who gave you that Dharma name.
It's a Plum Village thing.
Yeah, it is a Plum Village thing. Is there like a word like source, or like is there a concept of like a stream of where like life? I don't know.
So I'm not familiar, to be quite frank, on how in Plum Village tradition they use the source. Usually, actually, what comes to mind is quite the opposite in the Theravada tradition. But once again, this is language, and I'm also ESL, so English is my second language. So source can have a bit of a different connotation, perhaps, in my mind. So what comes to mind, actually, the source is usually where are we coming from, or where who am I? So actually, here's a teaching of that the Buddha gives us of essentially the two darts. So like, so that essentially it's kind of like if we were in the forest, and at a certain point we were hit by a dart, and and then someone came up to us and said, hey, well, here's the medicine, and here, like, let me remove the dart from you. And we're like, well, no, before you do that, I actually want to know the source of this dart. What's the material of the dart? Why was the intention of, like, the person who threw the dart? If it was a person, like, please, like, give me all this information. And in between, like, we died because we're basically inflicting even more suffering with ourselves. But instead, like we're trying to. The teachings of the Buddha are really more about not asking ourselves too many questions, but rather taking act that there is suffering. So there's this experience of dukkha that goes all the way from just the satisfaction, just like things are kind of crappy, all the way to old age, sickness, and death that we're all bound to. So the real suffering, the real dukkha. But when we're delusional enough not to be experiencing old age, sickness, and death in terms of at the forefront of our experience, even when things kind of seem like everything is kind of like great, it's actually also dukkha. Also sukha is dukkha, which is very difficult to actually quite grasp that as well. It's a process of delusion. We create a lot of fabrications, even in the things that we find great, that we find that we're not too concerned with, quote unquote, suffering. In fact, we don't usually use that word in English or in Italian, sofferenza. We don't use that word when it comes to that sort of experience. But rather, yeah, we're like, yeah, I mean, maybe it's great for a few seconds, but then there's kind of like that, you know, that dukkha. Actually, it's very noticeable. So in these days where we have so much actually material wealth in lots of parts of the world, and actually this country being, I think, the wealthiest country in the world, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the ones with the most tragic, actually, mental health issues. So we see that, you know, sometimes there's like, you know, real forms of dukkha that one experiences without actually having sort of physical requisites, like physical needs met, right? Like hunger is absolutely a great form of suffering. And so for most of human history, it seems like most of the focus has been actually on trying to somewhat address these obvious forms of suffering. But now that there are places in the world where it's not perfect, but it's the most perfect it's been actually in the way that we have history recorded. Still, actually, there's lots of dukkha, there's lots of depression, there's lots of actually an insanity of mental disturbances that come, that surface, that actually paradoxically to one that lives in a more sort of simplified, more humble life won't even have those sort of pathologies. So that's the dukkha. You know, it can come in so many different flavors. Where is the dukkha? And then we start noticing that also, like when there is pleasantness, when, you know, there's so many people in this country that are like, oh, everything is great. You know, I checked all the boxes, like every single list. And whoa, isn't this depressing? So yeah, so that's a big realization that sukha is also dukkha. And that's where, you know, if one doesn't have the teachings of the Buddha that tells us what is the cause, you can go completely crazy and suicidal and want to really end. You know, there's what we were talking about before bhavatanha, and then there's vibhavatanha. So not wanting to exist, but bad news, it's actually saying bhavatanha, because they're still wanting to have that sort of experience. We still want to be in a certain particular way, which is not to be. All right, so but it can be quite catastrophic, right? Extremely painful. So yeah, so the Buddha is like, whatever it is, you know, whether it's the brutal experience of hunger, of not having any of your needs met, to the depression of being the most privileged person in the world and still having that sense of dukkha, that, you know, there's a cause for that, and it's a universal cause. And yeah, which is craving, which is tanha. And then the good news, there is actually an end to this. So there is a cessation of this dukkha. We don't have to learn how to deal with this. Like just be there. Okay, this is how it is. Suck it up. My grandparents used to say Tita Campao, which means like just keep on living. Just keep on living. Like that's all there is there, essentially. And yeah. And then the Buddha goes further. He says not only there is a cessation, but there is, this is the way out. There's a way. This is what needs to be developed, and this is what needs to be eradicated. And so when we look at our problem with this perspective, then the source stops being too much of a concern, because we don't care anymore, like what that is there, in the sense of it's besides the point, you know. One can there's also lots of things that is just kind of go crazy, But even like the source of our sort of worldly problems in this lifetime, we can go to the therapist for ever and ever and ever, and like get to the source of some things, like, oh, I have anxiety because such and such thing happened, or because my parents blah blah blah. Like, we can kind of identify a few things here and there, but then there are some others that are completely incognitas. Like, I was born that way, so then maybe we kind of give it to genetics, etc. So can we really truly go to the source of things? I think that's where also we have perhaps ideas like there is a God creator, or there is, these days we have replaced God with the parents. So we usually like blame it all on the parents. We're like, okay, the parents creators, so thanks for all the good stuff. But the bad inheritance, it's all your fault, and I hate you. So, it's kind of like, yeah, we shift the sort of outer thing, but the substance, it's kind of the same in the way that we're relating to the world. But the Buddha's teaching I find refreshing, because it's just fully empowering, regardless of who one has as a parent, where one has lived, whatever conditions they're experiencing. It's more about, okay, like this needs to be cultivated. This needs to be eliminated, and one has something really tangible to work on, really tangible, so experience after working on it. This being said, I'm pretty sure that the source does not mean in the Plum Village tradition what I meant, what I just described. So I still encourage you to ask the source of the source.
It could be two kind of meanings. That it could be the source of the dukkha, or it could mean the source of this, because it would be dana, that is the source of dukkha, or it could be the source of why we are here. That could be karma too. So it depends on what source of what. And that is the question that you have to ask. That when you talk about source of what, before you can anybody can answer that question. Because just ask what source, and you just say, okay, source is just something that creates the next thing to follow. But sort of what?
I hope they didn't call you Tanha. That is really, that would be really not nice. Yeah.
Just to clarify, I also have one of the names I got there was of the source. It's the Mahayana teaching on shunyata. That's what the source is. So that
Sunyata.
clarifies it. Yeah.
Okay, of emptiness. Okay.
That's when Mahayana Buddhists use the word source, they're usually talking about.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, that's much better. Sunyata and Tanha.
It's not Green Nature delusion.
Yeah, well, then just in brief, emptiness, which can be very difficult to do in brief, but I'll try my best. Essentially, emptiness. Teaching that emptiness is essentially the teaching of anatta, so that there's nothing that is substantially who we think we are, or what we think it is. So we constantly, the fact that something is dependently arisen, as we were saying earlier, then by its definition is empty of something substantial.
So there's no source and there's no not source.
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah. I mean, we can get in very much then the intellectualization, but that's also why I love actually the name Empty Cloud, aside from it being the name of the monastery. But it really gives us that sense. It's, we see a cloud and we actually feel it. There's something there, but we try to grasp it, and it's empty of anything substantial. Or foam, there's lots of similes that the Buddha actually uses within the Pali Canon to, give us a bit of a sense of that.
I have a question from the live stream. Ram says, how can I not react, be mindful with body, both pain like skin burn, irritation, and also heavy urges, hunger, sexual. It's so hard to notice it always and be aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, no excellence can be acquired without constant practice. So that's we have to remember that the practice of Dhamma is in fact a practice. And so even if we understand it intellectually, there's still the stage that we were talking about, which is when we become Suttava Pastujanas. So perhaps we're not Asuttava anymore in the sense that at least we have the suttas. But we're still worldlings, so we still have lots of different habits, and it's unrealistic to expect that all of a sudden we're going to miraculously shift. It's kind of like, reading a book on dieting and then actually doing the diet, right? It's always Monday. I'll start on Monday. And then on Monday is next Monday. So unless we actually even train ourselves to do a diet, usually there are support groups, in fact, like the most successful diets or something. I don't know. I've never really done a diet, so maybe it's not the best example. But yeah, usually we go to reference. Like there's different causes and conditions that we put in place in order to get our result. And so it's the same. So we understand we train ourselves in mindfulness, and we also use the teachings that the Buddha tells us to do. So for example, if we notice that our mind tends towards greed, towards looking at all the beautiful things that there are in samsara, how everything is so pretty and beautiful and great, then the Buddha encourages us to essentially look at the drawbacks of our experience. Looking at the drawbacks, for example, if we think that ice cream is great, well, yeah, the creamy part is great, but let's focus also on the icy part, It can be a little bit uncomfortable. It's a bit of a, okay, it's not as great as I thought. Has both a gratification part, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be so obsessed with it, but there's also like, that. It's a little bit different, and then we can really cultivate a better understanding of the body, doing all the practicings, obviously, of the mark of the non-beautiful, which are quite plenty, especially if we volunteer. Maybe you can also mix into, aside from the actual meditation practice, the Subha meditation, one can actually go and volunteer in a lot of hospitals and a lot of places where people are not having the greatest sort of experience with the body. Can be very enlightening, can be very instructive. Also with old people, we start seeing lots of different things, and actually getting a little bit more in touch with the nature of the body. Also, if one likes meat a lot, one can go and visit factory farms and see how beautiful, and of course it's not beautiful, how tragic, how horrifying it is, the treatment of animals. And really also come to terms with the fact that actually the beautiful steak that they have in the plate is actually a sentient being. So we can start looking at that. And the point is not to become depressed, but rather to come a little bit disenchanted, remove the sort of glitter that we create about our experience. Now, interestingly enough, the Buddha says that if our mind has a propensity towards aversion, that we shouldn't actually look at the mark of the beautiful. I was really disappointed with that. At first, I was like, I'm always grumpy. I should probably cultivate a little bit more that subha. But no, the Buddha actually tells us that if our mind instead already kind of focuses towards grumpiness and towards seeing everything that could be improved in samsara, then actually we should just cultivate the Brahma Viharas, and in particular metta. And so, these are all like very good instructions that, we want to nourish the mind in order for the mind to then be able to respond properly. in one particular situation when we are either experiencing some kind of temptation or some kind of aversion. So we can't expect ourselves to, be nourishing ourselves with lots of thoughts of greediness and then and then be capable of acting not in accordance with greed when we're actually having the sort of opportunity. But rather we need to train our mind, starve our mind from thoughts of greed in order to then go like, oh, okay, actually, I see this experience for what it is, and I decide to do something else. And so, yeah, as we want to do more prep work, and then the prep work then creates the conditions in order for us to be able to act in accordance with Dhamma when we have those opportunities. So yeah, hope I answered your question. I don't know if Jagaro wants to offer some other reflections. Was it right?
Well said. I appreciated that. Venerable talking first. No, I think, yeah, he said it very well.
Okay. Maybe one last question, and then we can do a little bit more meditation. If there is anything else that people want to bring up.
Mixing a little bit with that aging and things that naturally happens to your body. When you were practicing the meditation and your body is having involuntary sensations, specific, I can say one is specific, like when you were, for women, you're getting old, you have that hot flash. You were in the middle of the meditation, everything is fine, you were okay. And then you have to take all your clothes out and go to the shower because it's so hot. I know in the Buddha time, probably this didn't happen because we didn't live that long.
Women had hot flashes.
We didn't live that long to have those things. And not every woman had that, but a lot of women have that. You were not in that age yet. But, you were in the middle of something, and then, if you can relate any, no solution, but any thoughts about those things that happens with the body, and we don't want that. We don't.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's funny that you say I'm not in that age yet, because my body decided to go shutting down earlier. So. So I am actually I have experienced it 2 or 3 times.
5 years.
But actually, it's a very interesting experience. Like sometimes when
it is,
you go,
but it's
So everything can happen in meditation practice. There's so many different experiences that can happen of unpleasantness of the body, and that's actually why we do it. Meditation practice to actually. Well, first of all, become familiarized with, it's not that we always have, for example, the experience of hot flash, even if we're subject to hot flash. It's also, we don't necessarily have lots of different things. Most of actually meditation practice, there's not much going on really. It's mostly noticing subtleties of changes within the body, within our experience. And we train ourselves to be there, to be present, to see. And then when there is something strong, which usually we start practicing with pain. Pain is normally what is always kind of ever present in long, at least, periods of meditation. At a certain point, if you sit down, just the nature of the body will start aching. And the first realizations that we have is how actually we're constantly reacting, with aversion, like we don't like this, I don't want this, I want to stop. So pushing away, rejecting the experience. I said, when, also meditation practice can be extremely pleasant. We're like, oh, I like that. Give me more than that, and it disappears. So we're constantly like pushing. There's this push and pull where we keep on chasing what we like, give me more of that, and we go away from what we dislike. And most of the practice is, usually can be actually during long periods of meditation retreat. A lot of times it can be just dull, like there's not really much going on. So we have to face our aversion towards neutral feelings, where we're actually sometimes the mind can even start wishing for pain to happen. Like, oh God, this is just so dull. Like, can I at least have some fulgurating pain to look at, right? And looking at that distress, looking at that wanting to experience something, I think it's very, very powerful. So the more we practice, then actually the more we start noticing, how essentially we're familiarizing ourselves in meditation, and we're also learning how to essentially act in a different way. So what we think that is a hindrance in meditation, for example, we can think, hot flashes can be a hindrance in meditation because perhaps, I was all like blissed out and relaxed, etc. But actually it's a great, great opportunity to, instead of like standing up and stripping, to actually endure and coming to an equanimity, that whether we have the body, there's an experience of a super hot body or a super cold body or a neutral body, it's fine. So it's actually a blessing that we have even such a strong sensation. First of all, because actually there's so much going on that one can actually do a whole body scanning, and like there's lots of different sensations, both physical and mental, that are happening there. So it's quite great without actually having to, do anything. The body's already like a nice, interesting canvas. And it's the same. And it's also great that we don't have the comfort of perhaps just kind of pursuing too much a kind of blissed out meditation. So the point of also samadhi, so cultivating concentration in Buddhism, it's not in and of itself like the goal, but rather it's an instrument to stabilize the mind in order to see the three characteristics. So in order to see vipassana, so in order to do vipassana meditation, in order to understand the way things are. So we need to understand the three characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta, the characteristic of impermanence, the characteristic of suffering, dissatisfaction, and the characteristic of anatta, so the impersonality of all things. So if our mind already actually has a propensity of like feeling very, very comfortable with meditation in the sense of stabilizing and tranquilizing the mind, great that the hot flashes come there to go like, hey, here's your vipassana practice of anicca, dukkha, anatta. And that also samadhi is unreliable. Like also the practice of concentration is unreliable. It's dependent. So in that moment, the hindrances are not present, but they're not eradicated. And the eradication only comes when we actually truly investigate our experience and train ourselves to behave in a different way. Let go of our desire to move, let go of our desire to strip, let go of our desire to experience something different than what we're experiencing. And so, this is what, that's why I'm quite happy about the gift that arrived this year. It's great. And Venerable, do you have any other thoughts to share?
He doesn't have hot flashes.
Hot flashes? You never know.
I can't say I have had hot flashes, but the Venerable, as well said. So when we're coming into contact with experience that we dislike, this is.
It's not dislike.
Like, it's
It's
okay,
not
more
dislike.
Okay, so please tell me what is it more Describe precisely.
It's an earthquake. That you never know when it's going to happen, and when it happens, it's always uncomfortable.
So you used the word before involuntary. Like, you mean like involuntary, you can't, like the reaction is involuntary? Is that what you mean? I wasn't quite sure.
No, it's voluntary because you have no control. Like an earthquake, there's no way to predict. It happens.
Exactly. So you're getting in touch with the first noble truth. Really, that's.
And it provokes in you a reaction that you cannot control.
Yeah.
It's impossible to control.
So this is where the encouragement of others that, right now, like you're saying, like, this is really, it's so intense. Like you said, you have to react to it. But the encouragement is that it's possible with practice to meet that experience. Now, right now, what you're saying is this particular, whatever the hot flash you experience are so intense, right? And that's understandable that, like you want to sit still. That's what you're trying to say. So instead of trying to think about like the goal is to sit still, think about how do I not immediately react? So what I mean by that is that, so you start to feel.
How you do not react with the earthquake under you.
I had an
It will go
experience.
away.
But I think he can say something about it because I think that it's like to be present. I went through menopause many years ago, and I had hot flashes, and I had that experience of sweating in the heart, right? And I think I just think that like the experience of being present with that heart. And it's so interesting today when I was doing the meditation, I don't have hot flashes anymore, but I felt the change in my body and I felt this hot. And I just was, okay, there is a hot here. And it was so interesting that it changed, as the sensation changed. And I think it's the same with the hot flash. It comes and goes, and it's gonna go.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I have experience too.
It's becoming a hot flash
Yeah.
sharing circle.
Normally the hot flash gonna die, you're not gonna die. The hot flash is gonna go away, but you're still around.
Yeah,
You're
but
not
anyway,
dying from there, so.
I
the
would
hot flash will
say
die.
that if one circumstance is too difficult to deal with at the moment, then one can do a little bit of slowing down and perhaps practicing when there are conditions that are less challenging. And then it's actually very connected to the question that the person asked online before. So it's, we want to do some preliminary practices in order to then be able to deal more skillfully with the earthquake. Like, we don't want to get into the earthquake straight away, right? It's just the same. We understand that with anything that is physical. So we don't, if we haven't even jogged around the monastery, it's a little bit difficult to go and do the marathon of New York, right? So we won't, if we go there, obviously, we're it's completely impossible to do this. So we want to first start training and jog around the monastery. Well, not around the monastery, but on the street, and then slowly build up a practice. And then that enables us to be competent during, then we are able to do the marathon essentially. But if we can't expect too much from us from the get-go. So speaking of which, I would say that we can now do a bit of walking meditation and then some sitting meditation, and then about 3:45 we can have some other Q&A also with Venerable Jagaro. And just a reminder that this will also be in noble silence, not the Q&A, but from now until the Q&A. So to keep silence, and we'll be doing walking meditation. You're welcome to both use the foyer, this room, the corridor here, and the dining room. There's also in the basement some space for to pick a stretch and go back and forth and practice mindfulness of walking. And we will be ringing the bell when we're ready to come back here.
Outdoors welcome too?
Yes, outdoors, I think it's okay. Yeah, sure.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.